It's been called one of the world's coolest museums and one of the country's best museums for a reason. Come discover America, its culture, inventions, people, and can-do spirit, and hundreds of hands-on ways to explore it, enjoy it, be inspired by it, and prepare to be astounded. Find your breakthrough moment at Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. Step into a world where past innovations fuel the imagination of generations to come through a vibrant exploration of genius in all its forms. Experience the strides of America's greatest minds while immersing yourself in their stories. Take a seat on the actual bus where Rosa Parks took a stand by taking a seat. Play pilot while exploring achievements in flight. And make yourself at home inside Buckminster Fuller's circular Dymaxion house. Put yourself in the place with the movers and shakers who blaze the trail of America and discover your own path at Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. Tap into your can-do spirit and experience the sights, sounds, and sensations of America's fascinating formation. Over 80 acres, brimming with ingenuity, are alive with 300 years of the American perseverance that reminds us anything is possible. Here, you can step into the lab where Thomas Edison had his light bulb moment, which is right around the corner from the workshop where the Wright brothers taught us to reach for the sky. Then, take a ride in a real Model T and visit the home of an ordinary farm kid from Michigan who grew up to put the world on wheels. You can rub shoulders with world-class artisans, walk through 4 working farms, and catch a train to explore Greenfield Village. Then discover your drive and pop open the hood of game-changing technology, sustainable design, and sheer manufacturing grit at America's greatest manufacturing experience. Get an inside look at the making of America's most iconic truck and rev up your inner engineer at Ford Rouge Factory Tour. And be sure to check out thf.org for more information and get an inside look at our Emmy Award-winning TV show, The Henry Ford's Innovation Nation with Mo Rocca. It doesn't matter where you come from or how you get here. You've simply got to get here. The Henry Ford. Get started at thf.org/visit to plan your experience today.
Hello, I'm Patricia Mooradian, President and CEO of the Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan. Thank you for taking time to learn about this magnificent attraction. We are an internationally recognized history destination just outside of Detroit. We bring the past forward by immersing our visitors in the stories of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and innovation that helped really shape a better world. We were founded in 1929 as a place that recognizes the common genius of the American people, our everyday heroes and dreamers who accomplished the extraordinary. Our unparalleled archive of American innovation consists of 26 million two-dimensional and three-dimensional artifacts that not only help us to understand the world we live in today, but inspire us to create a better tomorrow. This 250-acre National Historic Landmark includes 5 unique venues: Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, Greenfield Village, the Ford Rouge Factory Tour, a giant screen theater experience, and the Benson Ford Research Center. I encourage you to visit the Henry Ford when you get the opportunity. There really is no other place like it. Here is a look at just a few of our amazing stories, collections, and programs, including our national Emmy Award-winning television show, The Henry Ford's Innovation Nation with Mo Rocca. Thanks for watching and hope to see you soon.
We are driving in a 1965 Ford Mustang. Actually, it's not just any 1965 Ford Mustang. This is serial number 1. This is essentially where the whole pony car craze starts. This car was one of 180 Mustangs that were built as pre-production cars. Practice cars, if you will, that gave the line workers and the supervisors a chance to familiarize themselves with the Mustang's build. These cars were built in February and March of 1964 and then sent out to Ford dealers really across the US and Canada. Ford was eager to make sure that every major dealer had one car on view in the showroom in time for Mustang's official launch day, April 17th, 1964. So logically, the first cars built went to the farthest dealerships. That's how serial number 1 ended up in St. John's, Newfoundland of all places, about 2,000 miles from Dearborn. And there on April 14th, 1964, 3 days before the official Mustang launch day of April 17th, a young pilot by the name of Stanley Tucker convinced the dealers to sell the car to him. Now, this car never should have been sold, being a pre-production car. It just wasn't fit for public sale, but clearly Captain Tucker was a persuasive fellow, and he got his hands on the car, and he loved it. He drove it for about 2 years. In that time, wasn't too long before Ford Motor Company came back to Tucker trying to get the car back. Mustang was such a sensational seller, selling 680,000 cars in the first year and a half. They realized how important the car was, so they tried to get it back from Tucker. They negotiated back and forth. For understandable reasons, the captain was a little reluctant to give up the car. Eventually, they agreed to a trade. They brought Captain Tucker down to Dearborn in March of 1966 and gave him the 1 millionth Mustang in exchange for serial number 1. So he did all right. In fact, they let him option the car however he wanted, and the story goes that they gave him the option sheet, and rather than checking specific things, he just put a big X on the whole sheet. I want everything, fully loaded. But this car then, of course, went back into Ford's hands, and they in turn donated it to us in early 1966. So we have had the car for all but 2 years of its life, but it's been recognized as an important vehicle. When Mustang came on the scene, there was nothing else like it. It is a car that was fun to drive, and I think at the heart of it, that's the secret of the Mustang's appeal. But it's also just a cool looking car. I mean, you look at the front end, there's a little Ferrari in there, and yet it's not terribly expensive. In fact, their goal was to keep the price right around $2,500. Mustang is today, of course, not just a car, it's an American automotive icon. I mean, I think you could argue that it and Corvette, between the two of them, they probably best represent American motoring, not only here in the US, but around the world. Mustang is all about fun, and it's as fun to drive today as it was 54 years ago.
The number 1 Ford has established a lead of 32 miles. The expected challenge from Ferrari hasn't developed. 15 cars have already dropped out, trying to keep up with the bright red Ford.
It's one of racing's legendary stories. In 1963, Ford Motor Company agrees to buy Ferrari, the Italian automaker famed for its exotic sports cars and exceptional racing team. At the 11th hour, founder Enzo Ferrari backs out of the deal. Upset but undaunted, Ford chairman and CEO Henry Ford II, grandson of the company's founder Henry Ford, makes a decision. If his company can't buy Ferrari, then it'll beat Ferrari at the greatest sports car race in the world.
So they're going to go challenge Ferrari on their favorite ground, which at that time was the 24-hour of Le Mans. And this was a big gamble basically on Ford's part because they really had no experience in long-distance sports car racing. They were kind of out of their element, and this was a place where Ferrari had reigned supreme for years.
The 24 Hours of Le Mans, held each year in Western France, was never about speed. It was a test of endurance.
The circuit itself is about 8.34 miles around. There's some very sharp turns. There's an exceptionally long straightaway, the Mulsanne Straight, where this car, the Mark IV, was doing about 212 miles an hour. But at the end of that straightaway, there's this hairpin turn where you've got to slow down to about 30, 35 miles an hour to make it through there safely. So going through those kinds of things again and again and again throughout the course of 24 hours, you can imagine how hard that is on the mechanicals of the car, to say nothing of the strain it puts on the two drivers.
Just finishing the race was a major achievement, and a Ford victory wouldn't come easy. the company approached British engineer Eric Broadley of Lola Cars.
And he had a car called the Lola GT, which was a beautiful car, lowest car of really any around at that time, only about 42 inches off the ground. Ford decides they'll cut a deal with him and use the Lola GT as the basis of their next automobile. Though the Ford race car turns up being even lower than the Broadley car by 2 inches.
With its roof just 40 inches high, the racing press dubbed Ford's car the GT40. The car's debut at Le Mans in 1964 was promising. A GT40 led the first hour and a half, but 90 minutes are meaningless in a race of 24 hours.
They went into 64 probably thinking they'd put on a good show. I don't know if they thought that they'd win their first time out, but not so good a show. None of their cars actually managed to finish, so it must have been a little disappointing.
Ford turned to Le Mans veteran Carroll Shelby.
John Wire built the car and then took it to Le Mans in 1964, and it didn't do very good, and that's when they turned the program over to us in California.
Shelby's crew took the cars apart, cutting weight and improving airflow. And in February 1965, the GT40 earned its first victory at the Daytona 2,000-kilometer race. 4 months later, Shelby went back to Le Mans with a potent new weapon. The GT40 Mark II replaced the original 289 Ford V8 with the company's big, NASCAR-proven 427. But the French Classic brought disappointment again. 6 Fords were entered, none finished. Luck changed in 1966. Buoyed by wins earlier in the season, Ford brought 8 Mark IIs to Le Mans, backed by spare engines, equipment, and an army of 100 people.
We had specialists for everything was on hand if needed. I mean, wiper specialists, light specialists, engine specialists, wheels, brake. There were specialists there for everything if it should occur.
When race time arrived at 4 p.m., Henry Ford II himself dropped the starting flag. The Mark IIs set a furious pace. Drivers Ken Miles and Dan Gurney averaged better than 140 miles per hour on some laps. This time, however, it was Ferrari that failed to finish. As the race's end drew near, 3 Mark IIs led the field. Ken Miles and Denny Hulme were in first with the number 1 car, followed by Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon in the number 2 car. Ronnie Bucknam and Dick Hutcherson held the 3rd position with their number 5 car. Sensing a publicity bonanza, Ford executives hatched a plan.
Ken Miles had already won Daytona and Sebring. He was leading by a lap and a half, and the aristocracy at Ford decided they'd have all 3 cars cross the finish line at the same time because they were running 1, 2, 3.
Professionals all, the drivers did as they were told and crossed the finish line as close together as possible. But a technicality ruined Ford's scheme.
Le Mans, I've always thought they made the rule up that Bruce McLaren had started a little further back in the Le Mans start, so they said that they had run 50 feet further than the others. And if anything ever broke a man's heart, it was the fact that Ken Miles would have been the first and only person to ever win all 3 races in the same year.
Despite the voided tie, the 1-2-3 finish was a dramatic realization of Ford's goal. The campaign could have ended then and there, but within weeks, Ford made it official. It would return to Le Mans in 1967, and with an entirely new car designed and built in the United States.
We barely had taken time just to clean up the aftermath and inventory parts and things like that when the word came, hey, we're going to do it again.
Ford set its hopes on the experimental J car, named for its compliance with Appendix J of the Le Mans rulebook. Apart from the big block 427 engine and powertrain, it carried very little over from the Mark II. It was a leaner, lighter car, but just 2 months after the Le Mans triumph, Ford's GT program hit its lowest point when Ken Miles was killed testing the J car in California. Ford engineers struggled to correct the J car. They made the chassis stronger and reworked the body, but handling remained poor. Phil Remington, Shelby's top fabricator, flew to Dearborn, and within a week of round-the-clock work, he and the Ford staff re-sculpted the J car into a longer, sleeker, and safer car, the Mark IV.
He did a lot of the design work in as they said, the wind tunnel in his head. He kind of imagined how the car should look, changed some of the lines, the look of it, and then they actually tested it in an actual wind tunnel here in Dearborn and found out that Remington's design had shaved about 100 pounds worth of drag from the vehicle. So you've got this great mix of aerodynamic ability kind of piercing through the air, but also downforce holding the car to the track to prevent another accident of the type that took Ken Miles' life.
Their efforts paid off in the Mark IV's first race when it won the Sebring 12-hour in April 1967 with Bruce McLaren and Mario Andretti at the wheel. And now everyone looked forward to Le Mans. But Ferrari came to France with a new car of its own. The 330 P4 boasted a 244 cubic inch V12 capable of 450 horsepower, not far from the Mark IV's 500 horses. The Mark IV had an ominous debut at Le Mans when windshields cracked during pre-race practice. Ford had brought spares, but not enough for each of the Mark IVs entered. An urgent phone call was made to the States.
The next morning in Orly, in Paris, a 707 arrived with 6 windshields.
Crisis averted. On race day, Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt drove the red #1 car. Speed wasn't an issue for them. Keeping the car in one piece for the length of the race, that was cause for concern.
Well, the car was unbelievable fast. I mean, it was just very, very fast. Nobody could even run close to us. And the biggest thing was just keeping it running 24 hours.
The Mark IV was a great car, and if it had an Achilles heel, it would be in the brakes. The car was pretty heavy, probably 500 pounds heavier than most other cars in that same race. And it would go fast, 212 or so, a little bit more, and probably weighed pretty close to 3,000 pounds. So the brakes had a lot of work to do after a 3-mile straightaway where you're really cooking.
Gurney and Foyt took the lead after 90 minutes, and they never looked back. Through it all, they kept a disciplined pace. The strategy led to a surreal moment at 2:30 in the morning when one of Ferrari's top drivers pulled close behind Gurney.
Michael Parks was the team leading engineer for their sports car program and a very competent racer and engineer. Sure enough, here comes Mike Parks all over me, and he's on that light switch, you know, flicker, 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 like that, and you're kind of...
Parks was looking for a fight, hoping Gurney would push the Mark IV too hard or make a mistake.
I was getting pretty tired of it. And this went on for about 4 or 5 laps every time, and he's all over me, and I wanted to say, hey, listen, you know, let's get down to it, but I refused to do it. I just pulled off to the right after leaving Arnage, and there was a grass verge there. I pulled up and stopped on the grass. And Mike pulled up and stopped right behind us.
It was brilliant. He just pulled over and stopped.
For about 10 seconds, what felt like an eternity, the two leading cars sat at a dead stop. Gurney's ploy worked. The frustrated Parks pulled back on the track and sped away. Gurney, racing again on his own terms, caught and passed Parks within 5 laps.
That really was, I think, a signature illustration of how restrained Gurney was. And he was able to convince Foyt that that was the way to win this race, too. Let's not push this car so hard that we destroy it and knock ourselves out of the race in the process.
Le Mans took its usual toll on machinery. 3 Ford cars were lost in a single accident at 3:30 a.m. But the red #1 car never skipped a beat. When A.J. Foyt crossed the finish line at 4 p.m., he was 32 miles ahead of the second-place Ferrari.
There's the checkered flag.
He and Gurney had covered 3,250 miles in 24 hours and set a new average race speed record of 135.48 miles per hour. Foyt and Gurney climbed the winner's podium. As he stood there with a bottle of champagne in his hands, Gurney looked out over the crowd of press photographers.
So we're up there and looking, and there were just a sea of photographers down below, and they're all looking back at us, and there was a moment where nobody was telling us what to do, but I could tell that they were expecting something.
Caught up in the moment, Gurney shook his champagne and sprayed it over everyone.
It was like a fire hose. I was getting people maybe 15 feet away down below and just ruining all the cameras, and they were loving it.
It was the dawn of a new sports tradition and the perfect way to celebrate an all-American victory.
I had no idea it would create a tradition that is still there today. That was 1967, so it was a very special moment.
Ford Motor Company had made its point. It could build race cars as good as any in the world, and it could win the greatest race of them all.
There are hundreds of people that go into that victory. Engineers like Mose Nolan, team leaders like Carroll Shelby, folks at all levels who are making this win possible.
To put that program together inside a big company, it's the only program I've ever known that didn't have a budget, because Henry said we're going to do it.
It was a good project for the company at the time. The morale was very high. You felt very proud about being part of it.
It was a really great part of my whole driving career, and as an American on an American team and a team with an American, even though he's from Texas, it was a terrific victory.
You know, to me, it won Indy a couple weeks before that with Ford Power, and then have Ford Power over there. To me, it was a great honor to be at Le Mans one time. Like I said, that was my first and last time, and not planning on going back. So I can say last time I was there, I won the race, and that's it.
Hi, my name is Jacob Melbuff. I'm one of our mechanics here in the roundhouse at Greenfield Village. We are currently in the cab of Detroit and Lima Northern locomotive number 7. It's a 1897 Baldwin-built locomotive, and we're going to show you a little bit about what it takes to operate it. So let's take it away. Number 7 is a steam locomotive, which means we burn about half a ton of coal a day here at Greenfield Village to boil several thousand gallons of water every day. We use the steam that's created as a result to make the locomotive move forward. So there's 2 crew members up here in the cab. There's myself, I'm the fireman today, so I'm in charge of making sure we maintain our boiler pressure, keep the water level in the boiler at a safe level, and just make sure the engineer doesn't have to worry about running out of steam for pulling the train. The engineer, Matt, today is over on that side of the cab. He's in charge of operating the locomotive and the train cars behind it, so he has control of the throttle, the brakes, and which direction we go in. Up in the cab, there's all kinds of knobs and levers that do all kinds of different things for the operation of the locomotive. Right here is one of our 2 injectors. These are used to put water in the boiler. We store water in a car behind the locomotive called the tender. That contains our spare water supply as well as our coal. Right here is our sight glass, which is how we tell how much water is in the boiler at any given time. Of course, we ring the bell and blow the whistles at all our railroad crossings. So then looking over to this side of the cab, we have our throttle, which is basically the gas pedal in your car. We have the Johnson bar. That's kind of like a gear shift lever, even though steam locomotives don't actually have gears, but that's what makes it go forward or reverse. He's got 2 different brake controls. One of them is the automatic brake valve, which controls the brakes on the cars behind the locomotive, and then the independent brake valve, which controls the brakes on just the locomotive. The engineer's job is to maintain the locomotive throughout the day when the mechanics aren't around, so he has periodic lubrication duties he has to conduct. Of course, as a part of my job, I have to shovel coal. So to add coal, I'm keeping an eye on our pressure gauge, and occasionally it'll drop a little bit, but my job is to try to make sure it doesn't drop more than a couple pounds. Our boiler pressure is measured in PSI, or pounds per square inch. So if it starts to dip a little bit, it's probably time to add some coal. The main indicator, though, is actually watching the smoke from the smokestack. So if there's a little haze coming out of the smokestack, that means I've got a pretty good fire going, as long as my pressure is maintained at a constant level. If the smoke starts to get clear, that probably means that it's time to add a little bit more coal, because smoke indicates combustion. Our main goal here is to operate the train in a safe way. The other goal, obviously, since we're hauling tourists and people, is that we want to give them the smoothest ride possible. So that's why the engineer is so important, is by controlling the train, he can control whether it's going to be a smooth ride or a bumpy ride.
Hi, I'm Tim Pindell, a master presenter at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. And it all started right there, on what we think is the most famous bus in the United States and perhaps the world, when a little ordinary citizen, through life's experiences, did an extraordinary thing. A lady by the name of Rosa Parks, little seamstress, local department store in downtown Montgomery, Alabama, changed the world by saying one word. One word. Well, let me kind of set the scene for you. It's 1955, December 1st, in Montgomery, Alabama. There was racial tension throughout the South, and Montgomery was no exception. The Civil War had been over for 90 years. All of this was supposedly solved with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery, but not the case. The animosities were strong. Hatred, mistrust, misunderstanding of all kinds. It was a tough, tough time in American history. There were laws on the books called Jim Crow laws or segregation laws, separate but far from equal, between white people and black people. White people being supreme and black people being second-class citizens by these laws. And here's the law as it affected city buses in Montgomery and throughout the state, in this case of Alabama. The first 10 seats of every city bus were for white people only. The back 10 seats, the bumpy part of the bus, the least comfortable part of the bus, where you could actually smell the exhaust from the engine, were for black people only. Now we have 16 seats in the middle, and follow the law on that. Anybody could sit in those seats, except no African American could sit next to, across the aisle from, or in front of a white person. And if they did, and they didn't give up their seats, they'd be taken to the police station and put in jail, and maybe eventually get a visit from men in white robes late some night to terrorize your family, the Ku Klux Klan. So every time an African American got on a bus, they knew the consequences if they didn't play by the rules. Well, it was 6 o'clock in the evening on December 1st, 1955. This little African-American seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store got on this bus. She paid her 10-cent fare. Rosa Parks was her name. Now, Rosa got off the bus after she paid her 10-cent fare. Any idea why she did that? Well, the law said that African-Americans couldn't walk directly to their seats because they'd have to walk through the white section. Every African-American would have to pay their 10-cent fare, get off the bus, and go in the back of the bus. Well, that's what Rosa Parks did. She played by the rules. She went into the back of the bus, and where did she find her seat? Right there. Right there. Now, that's okay. That's behind the 10 seats of the white section until you got to the third stop of the bus in front of the Empire Theater in downtown Montgomery. This bus is full, 10 whites, 26 African Americans. No seat could be found. And the bus driver, James Blake was his name, opened the door in front of the Empire Theater, saw one man standing there, one white man. Looked back and saw there's no place for him to sit. Get up out of there. Now, was he talking just to Rosa Parks? No, because no African American could sit next to, cross the aisle from, or in front of a white person. 2 African American ladies, African American gentlemen sitting next to the window, and here on the aisle, Rosa Parks. All 4 were demanded to give up their seats, to get up, go to the back of the bus, and stand for one white man to have a seat. They didn't move. None of the 4 moved. They didn't say a word, defying the bus driver and his law, the segregation law. We gave him one more chance. You all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats. Well, reluctantly, 3 of the 4 got up, stood at the back of the bus. But not the little lady, not the little seamstress, not the ordinary citizen who was about to do an extraordinary thing. She looked at that bus driver and she said one word. And that one word created a spark that would lead over the weekend in Montgomery, Alabama, in the black community to a blaze and eventually coast to coast an explosion across our land. She put every African American before her time, during her time, and forevermore squarely on her little shoulders. Rosa Parks said no. Probably didn't say it any louder than that. She just said no. Well, the bus driver called the police. Yeah, they knew it was going to happen. 2 police officers got on this bus, took her off, took her by squad car to the Montgomery City Jail, where she was treated like a common criminal, charged with disorderly conduct, breaking the segregation law of the day, and she was put in a cell. But here's the amazing thing that happened. This spark that we're talking about led to that blaze in the hearts, minds, and souls of the black community, and some whites joining in support over the weekend, particularly in the churches in Montgomery on Sunday, in outrage. The black community came together as one. We're going to hurt the bus lines where it hurts them the most because of how they treated Rosa Parks. We're going to boycott the buses all day long on Monday, the day that Rosa Parks goes before the judge. 3 out of the 4 people who rode buses every day in Montgomery were black. Only stands to reason if we have a one-day boycott of not riding those buses, it's going to hurt them in their pocketbook, in the cash register. Money talks, and maybe then they'll listen to us. But we'd better have a great leader that makes sure that that boycott is a success. Nobody better be riding those buses, and we get as many of our white brothers and sisters to join in us in support. But who's that great leader going to be? A half a mile from where all of this happened was a church called the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Had a new pastor there, just 26 years old, wasn't nationally known, but he had something special. You know who that guy was? Martin Luther King Jr. And he led that boycott so successfully through one day. Let's extend it to a week, to a month, to a year. That boycott went 381 days. African Americans and some whites joining in support were doing anything but riding these buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Most of them were walking to school, to church, to their businesses, to the grocery store, anything but ride those buses. And it almost bankrupted the bus lines. But it also gave time for a court case on segregation of buses in the South, in Alabama, to go all the way to the federal Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. And our Supreme Court justices in late 1956 ruled that the segregation of buses in the state of Alabama was unconstitutional. Victory. So Rosa Parks and anybody of color in the state of Alabama could sit anywhere they wanted on any bus they wanted. So 385 days after she was arrested, Rosa Parks could get back on this bus one more time. She didn't sit in the back row, did she? She didn't sit in the middle. She sat right there on the front row, where she never could have sat before. It was in the white section before, and it never could have sat in front of a white man who was a seat behind her. And when you look at the eyes of Rosa Parks in that picture, you look at a lady who in those 385 days, from the time that she was arrested until that moment when she could sit wherever she wanted to on that bus, she had been fired from her job for what she believed in, for what she stood up for by sitting down. She had received death threats. All sorts of indignities had happened to them, but she stayed the course. King stayed the course. They did not give up. They held their ground and stood up by sitting down for what they believed in. Now, this was in 1956. She moved to Detroit, her and her husband Raymond, in 1957 and lived here for the last 48 years of her life. 2003, we put the bus on display. She came to see it one last time before she died. Sadly, she died at the age of 92 in 2005. If she could have lived for 7 more years, in 2012, the mother of the American Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks, and the leader of the free world, the first black president of the United States of America, Barack Obama, would have been on the bus at the same time. Rosa Parks said no, and the rest is history.
During my lifetime, I resisted the idea of being mistreated and pushed around because of my race, and I felt that all people should be free regardless of their color. And when the driver demanded that we give up this seat, I felt that the time had come to not take it anymore. I had had enough, and this was truly the end of being pushed around.
One of the most annoying parts of adulting is when you have to move. Whether it's an apartment or a house, it's never easy to pack up all your belongings and ship them off to a whole other home. Well, here in Greenfield Village at the Henry Ford, moving day takes on a whole other meaning, and nobody makes big enough boxes for it. Strolling through Greenfield Village is like stepping back in time, where every structure reveals a story that links us to the past. But how these buildings were acquired and moved from their original locations to Dearborn, Michigan, are tales unto themselves. The Henry Ford's curator of historic structures and landscapes, Jim Johnson, invited me to talk about the lengths Henry Ford went to preserve history. Where do all these historic buildings come from?
It's just an amazing story how this place came together. There's between 80 and 90 historic structures here in Greenfield Village. They all have a different story. They've all come from a different place.
Which building impresses you most in terms of having been moved from its original site?
The one that we're sitting in front of right now. This is the Cotswold Cottage. This process was a 2 to 3 year process, identifying the building, restoring the building in England with English craftsmen, dismantling the building, packing it, shipping it by rail, then container ship across the Atlantic Ocean to New York. Then it was shipped by rail here to Dearborn and then reassembled.
Was this just because Henry Ford liked the Cotswolds, that section of England?
That's exactly why. He vacationed there, he did business there.
These tea sandwiches are great. Do they come with the cottage?
It comes with tea, yes, here at the cottage. This is a big deal.
What about the Logan County Courthouse?
That's probably the most contentious of the acquisitions that Henry Ford got. The building was in Postville, Illinois, and it was a building in which Abraham Lincoln practiced law on the judicial circuit that he was working at the time. Henry Ford had to make a visit there to convince folks, say it was okay to move the building, and he did convince them, and very quickly, despite movements against him taking the building, he got the building down and got it moved here to Greenfield Village and reconstructed in a matter of weeks.
At the time, Henry Ford was one of the world's most successful businessmen. If a historical building caught his eye, money was no object trying to acquire it. Are some of these buildings that for sure would have been destroyed, would have disappeared?
Absolutely. A good example is the Noah Webster House, which Henry Ford actually bought from the wrecking company. It stood on the campus of Yale University, and the building was slated for demolition. But they got there just in the nick of time to get it.
And one of the most well-loved houses must be the Wright Brothers Bicycle Shop.
Definitely. It was really in that shop is where a lot of the sort of science and the concept of actually flying was figured out. Henry Ford bought it from the same man that was renting it to the Wright brothers when they were developing the airplane there. So it was dismantled and moved here to Greenfield Village in the 1930s.
How much longer can this go on acquiring buildings for the village?
Well, our acreage here is close to 300 acres, and there's areas that be less than contiguous, but there's room to do all sorts of things.
Well, it's been a pleasure eating and talking with you, and I hope we never have to leave, because honestly, I could move right in.
Hello, I'm Jim Johnson. I'm the director of Greenfield Village and the curator of historic structures and landscapes here at the Henry Ford. And behind me is the future home of the vegetable building from the Detroit Central Market. The city of Detroit approved plans to construct this vegetable building in April of 1860. It desperately needed an improved public market in a central location to ensure that all Detroiters could access fresh vegetables, meats, and fish, as well as eggs, honey, butter, and cheese. The architect, John Schaefer, designed an open-sided structure nearly the size of a modern football field. His design combined traditional timber framing for the roof structure and the relatively new technology of cast iron for the supports. This rare example of a public market building is truly a survivor. After 30 years of service, city officials voted to close the market, and in 1894, it was moved to Belle Isle, where it served many uses, including that of a riding stable. In 2003, with demolition imminent, the city of Detroit offered the structure to the Henry Ford, saving it from being destroyed. We continue to learn about the history of this amazing building. The Detroit City Council minute books not only provide amazing details about the process of constructing the building, but also specifics about all the vendors, including the hucksters who sold produce near the market either from their own wagon or from a handcart. City directories fill in the blanks about so many of the people who made their livelihoods at the Central Market by providing names and occupations of those who paid rent for stalls. These vendors sold directly to customers, a personal exchange that drew customers from inside and outside Detroit. Shutting down the Central Market, including the vegetable building at the end of 1893 season, was met with resistance. Some, including a well-known vendor, Mary Judge, remained vocal into early 1894 before the move to Belle Isle. Restoring the vegetable building and bringing the stories of the people that worked and shopped there adds the urban market experience to the many food stories told daily throughout the Henry Ford. Thank you for making this possible.
Welcome to Firestone Farm. This is the birthplace and boyhood home of Harvey Firestone. We are a working farm that showcases the daily lives of the Firestone family. Here we eat seasonally, meaning what comes out of the garden at any given time is what's usually on our table. Today, we're going to be talking about our salads here at the farm. Using heirloom varieties, we're able to put together a lovely salad, much different than the salads that we do have today. Here in 1885, we're able to let one ingredient usually be the star and let its individuality shine through. One of my favorite salads, and truly the most fresh, is our basic tomato salad. It includes heirloom varieties of tomatoes like Brandywines or Oxheart, just some basic chopped celery on top, and then finished with the dressing of your choice. And here at Firestone Farm, we are able to make our own dressings and bottle them and keep them in a cool space. Another one of my favorite salads here at Firestone Farm is a cabbage salad. You're simply going out into your field, removing a head of cabbage, chopping it finely, and incorporating a cooked dressing that includes a walnut-sized piece of butter, some fresh cream, vinegar, egg, and seasoning to taste. One of our favorite salads that's often on the Firestone dinner table is a simple lettuce salad. Today, what would be considered artisan lettuces, we put on our table as a Paris Cosse, a black-seeded Simpson, and a tennis ball lettuce. To incorporate the dressing into your lettuce salad, you're simply going to mash some egg yolk fine, include some butter. Even though the recipe calls for olive oil, the Firestones would have had butter more readily available. You're mixing that in with some mustard to taste and incorporating about a teacupful of vinegar, and that's poured over your lettuce to serve. All of the recipes featured today did come from our Buckeye Cookery. It is a period-appropriate cookbook that families of this time period used in order to use the most of what's coming out of their garden and putting directly onto their table. What's considered trendy today, the farm-to-table movement, was simply a way of life for the families of this time period.
Ruth Adler Schnee is remarkable because she moved the cause of women everywhere forward, not only in design and in art, but everywhere really. Ruth Adler Schnee was born in Frankfurt, Germany. Her family was art-oriented, design-oriented, and so was Ruth. Her family was a Jewish family in Germany. In 1939, they fled Germany after their home was ransacked on the evening of Kristallnacht. Prior to World War II, Ruth Adler Schnee was inspired by art that was considered degenerate by the Nazi regime. These were colorful, they were abstract, they were figurative, and Ruth really became inspired by those works from a young age. Ruth Adler Schnee was in the forefront of the modernist textile design movement. She was one of the first to utilize really bold, clear, clean color and abstract patterns for use in modern homes and modern commercial offices. What's most inspiring about her work is that it challenges us to think about our world more thoughtfully, even just finding beauty in our everyday life. Her designs have a little bit of magic to them. They look like something that you might have seen or that you might know about, but it abstracts them enough to make you think about it again. They're so colorful, they're so bold, and you can imagine at the time, most modern interiors were just white walls. What a statement those textiles would have made. It really humanizes design. It really humanizes those environments. Ruth Adler Schnee is a remarkable woman. She is a designer, of course, but she's also an entrepreneur. She was a business owner. She was a Jewish immigrant in a really difficult time in our country, and somebody who, against quite a few odds, did really well for herself and is now among the canon of very important mid-century designers in this country. Ruth Adler Schnee's work is still relevant today. It's actually still being manufactured. She is truly an inspiration. Still at 95 years old, she's still designing. She's incredible.
We have 10,000 pieces of glass at the Henry Ford. This is the Davidson Gerson Gallery of Glass, which shows you 300 years of American glass making and glass history, from the beginnings of American glass through the present. And there are many unique pieces in this exhibit that we own and no other institution owns in the world. From the earliest American glass through press glass, and that's a really important American innovation. There is a tin lantern made in the 1830s, and it's the only surviving example of a press glass window in its original context. By the mid part of the 19th century, America was the world's premier glassmaker. We look at how glass was used in the household environment. Victorians loved to show things off. So we have imported glass, and we have high-end glass in there, cut glass specifically. And then we move on to art glass, which is really part of showing off, but it's unique because it uses technical innovation. During the early 1890s, Louis Comfort Tiffany pioneered a technology that made glass iridescent, meaning that it shines and shimmers in light, and people loved it. He made pieces as simple as household wares like glassware, up through really wild things like light fixtures. It was part of a movement called the Art Nouveau. And the Art Nouveau was about producing sinuous, organic shapes and forms. Tiffany took that idea and that aesthetic and made it his own into something that was uniquely his, uniquely American, but it was also then universal because the technology became so ubiquitous. That glass was used for things like ketchup bottles. We have a huge Heinz collection here. Ice cream parlor ware, Pyrex. And then some of my personal favorites are the tumbler sets that people used in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in their households. And then we jump right into studio glass. Almost every major figure represented in this gallery. Talking about the earliest studio glass, the technical innovation of studio glass, and how it became a major art form in the last quarter of the 20th century in America into the 21st century. That's the broad sweep of glass in American society. People can see how it informed early American history and became part of American culture in the 19th century. And that truly is what this gallery is about.
This is a mechanical Jacquard loom. This technology was developed in France in 1803 by a weaver named Joseph-Marie Jacquard. The key thing about this loom is that it controls every warp thread, the threads that go from the front to the back of the loom, individually. Because it can do that, the loom can create very complex, fancy patterns in the cloth more quickly and with greater accuracy than the technology available before this loom was developed. These cards are what carry the instructions that are read by the apparatus on the second floor that tells the loom what pattern to create. The holes in the cards are read by a series of pins up in the apparatus, and those holes tell the apparatus which threads down here should be raised for each pass of my shuttle across the warp. Some of you might recognize these cards as looking similar to computer punch cards. Back in the early days of computer technology, punch cards carried instructions that told the early computers what kind of calculations to do. So this loom is the great-great-great-grandfather of the computer technology that we all use today, and that technology started with a machine that produces cloth.
I have a question for you, and you can all argue amongst yourselves. Is it more important that we have electricity, light, or Rihanna? In a way, all three were created right here. This is the actual workshop of Mr. Thomas Alva Edison. If walls could talk, these might be a little braggy and annoying. Over here is the first phonograph. Over there, the light bulb was invented. You know electricity? Yeah, Thomas Edison came up with that too. See, annoying, but amazing.
Home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word,
and the
skies are not cloudy.
Why am I talking so loud? Because this is legendary inventor Thomas Edison's 1877 predecessor to the record player. I had to shout. The technology was still primitive, so the foils could only faintly record sound.
All day.
Okay, let's see what we have here.
Back then, it was unheard of to record sound and then to play it back again. I mean, that's borderline time travel if you really think about it.
Very good.
I could have been a little bit more on key, but we could fix that with auto-tune.
Could I sign you up? I'll be your agent, maybe?
This and so much more is housed in Menlo Park, the location in Greenfield Village at the Henry Ford, where Thomas Edison's New Jersey lab of the same name has been reconstructed. Only pieces of the original structure remain, but it's true to its original look. And Edison wanted his lab to stay on New Jersey soil, so 7 truckloads of New Jersey dirt were brought here to be the foundation. Inside, it's a glass menagerie of innovation and history. After maybe 1,000 tries, this is where Edison invented the light bulb. Candle makers were none too happy. The Henry Ford's chief curator, Mark Ruther, told me a little more about Edison's legacy.
The story of lighting, the story of electricity is one of a lot of things that are rendered essentially invisible. Edison's success was understanding the totality of that. So the most visible of those inventions was this light bulb. But all the other things that went into making that workable and usable and safe, he had to engage with all of those.
One could argue few people can touch Edison when it comes to how profoundly he transformed our world. And it's that transformative quality that creates the distinction between invention and innovation.
Inventing relates to the creation of entirely new things. Things like a phonograph, things like a light bulb. Innovation really is about how those things are adopted and adapted.
Edison was the man who figured out how to create light for one and for all. Illuminating. When I was in grammar school, I was so jealous of my friend Parker. Every day her lunch bag was packed with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, all soft and gushy and delicious. Don't get me wrong, my lunches were great too, thanks Mom, but I can still smell that PB&J with the Concord grape jelly oozing out the sides. The fact is, unless you're allergic, peanuts have been a huge part of many of our lives. And there's one innovator to thank for that, and I cannot tell a lie, he did not chop down that cherry tree. Wrong, George. The man I'm referring to is George Washington Carver. While George Washington is known as the father of our country, Carver is considered the father of something extremely important to the South, to this country, and to the world.
He was an agricultural scientist. I would call him one of the first organic farmers because he believed in returning to the soil nutrients and biomass from natural things.
I met up with the Henry Ford's curator of agriculture and the environment, Deborah Reed, in front of Carver's memorial cabin in the museum's Greenfield Village.
Look at this portrait.
Irving Bacon did this. So Ford's favorite artist, but it's a tribute a year after George Washington Carver died.
What is his legacy? What did he succeed in doing?
He was the first African American to hold a master's degree in agricultural science in the country and went to Alabama. Their soil had been depleted, soil that had been planted in cotton for generations. So he had to change all forms of their agricultural practice.
Not only was the farmland of the South depleted of vital nutrients such as nitrogen, but a boll weevil infestation in 1915 wiped out nearly 75% of its cotton crop. Farmers were desperate for help. Why do most people associate George Washington Carver with the peanut?
The peanut would fix nitrogen. I know, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a complicated thing.
Yeah, it is. He wrote bulletins and he illustrated this. He drew artwork that helped people understand that if they planted the peanut, that the ways that the roots worked helped fix nitrogen in the soil. So it didn't deplete it, it held it there.
This is his home. Is this a replica?
In 1937, Henry Ford asked George Washington Carver to come and speak, and Ford was smitten with him. They were taken with each other. Ford wanted to honor him, and so he asked for his memories of his boyhood home.
Henry Ford built this cabin in Greenfield Village, and Carver personally showed up for the dedication, even spending the night in it in July 1942.
I believe Henry Ford built the cabin because he wanted to honor this very well-known and respected black scientist in 1942. In the context of World War II and debates about civil rights and equality in the military, it was a statement.
And Carver's selfless efforts to innovate agricultural and economic opportunities for all farmers makes him one of our great American heroes.